I'll go ahead and get started. My name is Wesley Fleming. I work primarily with our industrial clients, managing environmental regulatory compliance. That's a little about me. So in my talk today, we're going to extend our discussion on greenhouse gases, which we've heard quite a bit about this morning. We're going to extend that topic into this idea of co-pollutants, these other things that are emitted along with the greenhouse gases. We will talk through some definitions, kind of get a common understanding of the subject, and then we'll move on to the alignment that we can achieve through common management of both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, and we'll see that through a series of case studies. Big idea for today is that the demand for emissions reporting is at an all-time high. I think many of you are living that day in and day out. That may be why you're in this seat today. We also have a very well-established understanding of the sources of greenhouse gas emissions and the sources of other air co-pollutants and the relationship between those two. Even if you don't have a technical background, a chemistry background, I think we all intuitively know that to be true. There's more coming out of the tailpipe of a gasoline automobile than just CO2, right? There are other things that are emitted along with that, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And when we take these first two facts together, what we will see is that managing both your greenhouse gas emissions and your emissions of these other co-pollutants, managing those together and doing so effectively leads to increased efficiency and accuracy of what you're reporting, as well as strategic reductions opportunities. Before I go any further, I want to pause here for a minute and get back to this idea of compliance and sustainability. That was at the core of some of the questions that I was asking. In many companies, these two topics are really treated separately, maybe by separate people, by separate departments, separate initiatives within the company, and they're often handled separately and sort of in parallel. And we don't see those as separate activities that can be handled effectively separately and in parallel. Rather, we see compliance as the foundation upon which you can build your sustainability program and management system and ultimately create value for your company. And what I'll be discussing today with greenhouse gases and co-pollutants is one example of the advantages that can be achieved through that integration of compliance and sustainability. By no means the only example, but this idea of the integration of compliance and sustainability is very much at the heart of today's topic. All right, moving on to some nuts and bolts here. When we talk about greenhouse gases, we often think of CO2, not incorrectly, but that's not the entire picture either. There are other greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide, as well as a whole slew of very potent fluorinated gases that are all within that greenhouse gas umbrella. We typically treat those greenhouse gases separately from these other gases that I'm just going to call the co-pollutants. These are the other things that are coming out of that same stack, that same pipe, whatever it is, along with our greenhouse gases. In most cases, we don't just have emissions of greenhouse gases, we also have emissions of these co-pollutants. And our handling of these is often separate, and there are regulatory drivers for that. So those of you that are working on the compliance side will recognize these pollutants on your right as the criteria pollutants and the air toxics. And so there are regulatory drivers for why we handle those separately. Again, today we're going to focus on the advantages of integrating our handling of these. When we look at the sources of greenhouse gases and the sources of co-pollutants, really the elephant in the room, if you will, is combustion. When we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions, we are almost always talking about combustion. Not the only source of greenhouse gas emissions, but a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Combustion is also a significant source of these other co-pollutants. So anytime we have combustion, we're emitting not only the greenhouse gases, but these co-pollutants. There are other edge cases where we may be considering greenhouse gas emissions from our electricity usage, but we're really not considering our emissions of co-pollutants from our electricity usage. Likewise with our mobile sources. The inverse of that is also true, and again, this has regulatory drivers. When we're looking at emissions from many industrial processes, we are often solely focused on the emissions of the co-pollutants and maybe not on emissions of greenhouse gases. Doesn't mean they're not there, but we may not be taking those into consideration. Most of the rest of the talk is really going to focus on combustion. It is a significant source of both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, and it's also something that affects everyone. So that will be where we head now. When we look at combustion products, again, we see both greenhouse gases and the co-pollutants. Depending on your activity, perhaps you're only focusing on one or the other. But when we think about the physical molecules that are coming out of a process, both are there. And there are advantages to remembering that both are there and managing them together. There are frameworks for reporting both greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, and they are separate. And that is part of the reason that we often manage these activities separately, because the frameworks are separate. You may be reporting your greenhouse gases through a sustainability report or through supply chain reporting, we've heard about this morning. On the co-pollutant side, you may be reporting that to the state or the EPA through mandatory reporting from a federal rule or from your facility's air permit. And even in cases where you may be reporting the same thing, if you have mandatory reporting of greenhouse gases and you're voluntarily reporting your greenhouse gas emissions, it seems like that should be apples to apples. We're talking about greenhouse gases. In almost every case, what you're reporting in these two different areas is not going to be the same. And that's not because you're trying to pull a fast one on anybody or because you've made a mistake in one set of calculations. It really comes down to the scope of what's required under these different reporting platforms. And for many companies, the fact that these are not equal has been reason to really separate out these activities. And throughout the rest of the talk, I hope you can see, hope I can illustrate to you the advantages of not handling those separately, but rather integrating those activities. And when we can manage our greenhouse gases and our co-pollutants together, we'll look at four key advantages there: common data sources, the common skills that are required for gathering, manipulating, and calculating. And then we'll look at some management impacts on risk reduction, compliance assurance, as well as finding that strategic alignment that we talked about previously. I'm going to attempt to use a little analogy here about cooking. So even if you have never calculated greenhouse gas emissions for your facility, hopefully you have cooked something or at least eaten something, and you can track with that analogy here. First up, common data sources. Whether you're looking at greenhouse gases or co-pollutants, the data that's used in the estimation of those emissions is going to be the same, or there will at least be a lot of overlap there. In terms of your production data that you're using, any kind of activity data at your company, that often comes from utility invoices. And because this data is common between the two activities, there is a level of accuracy that can be achieved when you understand the entire data set and you understand what's required by the different reports that you are putting together, what's within the scope of those reports. And that allows you to put together a better data request. You can ask for the right information. Once you receive that information, you can better understand that information, what's included in the data, what's excluded from the data, what maybe needs to be combined, what's already been combined. And so managing that process together for both of these groups leads to a greater level of accuracy. Also leads to a greater level of efficiency because these data sources are common. For our food analogy here, how many times a week do you eat dinner? It's not a trick question.
7.
Okay, how many times do we go to the grocery store? Probably not 7, right? Same idea here. This is most efficient for you. It's also most efficient for your colleagues who may be providing you with this data. So the fewer times you can go back to them with a data request, the better they'll appreciate that. Knowing what data you need is crucial, but once you have that data, there's also a common set of skills involved in wrangling that data, manipulating that data, getting it in the format that you need, the units that you need, then actually carrying out those emissions calculations. So really the mechanics of doing those calculations are common between the two, and you can realize an advantage there by handling those together. Again, here we see a level of familiarity that can be gained when you understand the entire set of data that you're working with, as well as the individual subsets of the data that you may be using just for greenhouse gas reporting or just for your emissions reporting. And you can avoid both over-reporting and under-reporting when you understand both sides of that equation, and you're looking at both of those together. On the management side, what we also see are opportunities for both risk reduction and compliance assurance. We are attempting to manage our compliance risks alongside of our customer demands. And what we want to achieve is confidence in the reporting that we're doing to each of these stakeholders, and in managing risks from both sides of that, and in satisfying both of those stakeholders, and not leaning too far into one at the expense of the other. Both your customers and their desires and their demands, as well as your regulators and their demands, both important stakeholders for the success of your business, and being able to manage both of those effectively is very important. We also have opportunities for strategic alignment. And what I mean by that is that when you are looking specifically at reduction strategies at your facility, how can we include both the compliance and the sustainability impacts of those reduction strategies? Are you considering any potential regulatory barriers to reduction? Or on the flip side, are you considering the double impact of some reduction strategies? So in other words, how can I reduce my greenhouse gas emissions and reduce my regulatory burden with the same initiative? And there are certainly opportunities to do both of those, and that's obviously a great thing. I'll move through a couple of case studies now to try and highlight these points and show you how they've played out for some of our clients. First up is a little bit of a non-example, which maybe seems like a weird place to start, but hang with me. This is a precision machining plant that was tracking and reporting their solvent emissions, specifically methylene chloride, which is a volatile organic compound, as well as a hazardous air pollutant, heavily regulated for those reasons. However, methylene chloride is not a greenhouse gas emission. So when this facility was looking at their Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, which were primarily from natural gas combustion, and when they were looking at their regulated emissions from solvent use, these were largely separate exercises. From a chemistry standpoint, even, these emissions are completely separate. And so it's easy to think that these should be totally separate. I think there's still an advantage to managing them together, particularly for those first two things that we listed, the common data sources and the common skill sets that are required to gather the data needed for both of these types of tracking and reporting, and then for actually calculating both of these. Our second example is an automotive manufacturer. For this client, we are tracking on a monthly basis their natural gas usage from their utility invoices. That may sound familiar. We're doing this on the compliance side for emissions tracking and regulatory reporting. Their regulated natural gas usage, the part that we're looking at for their emissions reporting, is a subset of their total natural gas usage. However, when we're pulling this data each month to do this regulatory exercise that we're required to do by their air permit, we are tracking all of their natural gas data from this invoice. And what that means is at the end of the year, when they want to look at calendar year greenhouse gas emissions, a majority of that effort, at least for the scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, is already done for us. We already have the data in the format that we need it, in the units that we need it. We have throughout the year gathered all of that data. We're very close now to having the greenhouse gas emissions that we want to calculate, rather than starting really from square one, which is what many companies would do if you had separate people or separate teams of people who were handling this data and doing these calculations. Third example is a diesel engine assembly plant. Similar to the previous one, this facility was tracking and reporting their scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions. They were also tracking their diesel and natural gas emissions from combustion of those fuels for regulatory compliance. Their air permit required them to do that. And like I said before, that usage from the emissions from the diesel and natural gas that was regulated was a subset of their total usage. So their air permit regulates specific pieces of equipment, specific processes. And so what that means is the emissions reporting that we're doing for regulatory compliance is not all inclusive. It's not going to be equal to our scope 1 emissions. But let's not stop there and say that they're separate and handle them separate. Let's see what happens when we look at them together. This is really just a visual here of what I said before. This facility's scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions from their combustion of diesel and natural gas was a larger value, and then they had a subset of that was their regulated emissions from their combustion of diesel and natural gas. What this facility was able to do was install more efficient boilers, and that greatly reduced their natural gas usage and their emissions from their combustion of natural gas. And of course, what that did was it reduced their greenhouse gas emissions. Because of this relationship between greenhouse gases and the co-pollutants, because they are emitted together by the same chemical process of combustion, they also reduced their regulated emissions. And this was very significant for this facility because in their reduction of their regulated emissions, they went below a regulatory threshold. And what that meant was they were able to greatly reduce their regulatory burden through these reductions that they achieved. And so this is an example of that double impact I was talking about earlier, where they not only reduced their greenhouse gas emissions, which was a great thing, but they were also able to greatly reduce their regulatory burden by reducing their emissions of those co-pollutants. Every project that you implement at your facility is not going to be, a slam dunk like this, where you're going to have this synergistic benefit between your co-pollutants and your greenhouse gases. But those opportunities are definitely out there, and we should absolutely be looking for those opportunities and really prioritizing those opportunities when we're looking at emissions reductions opportunities and our strategies around reductions. We should be looking for these types of relationships and really taking advantage of them. For my final example here, we have a metallurgical coke producer. This is a large publicly traded company. They are very heavily regulated because of their use of coal and their combustion of coal and all of the toxic emissions that go along with that. So very heavily regulated industry, including their emissions of greenhouse gases. There are not that many facilities. It's typically the largest facilities, a lot of utilities, or other large consumers of fossil fuels where their greenhouse gas emissions are regulated. Most of the greenhouse gas tracking and reporting that we talk about is voluntary. Maybe your customers demand and it doesn't feel voluntary, but from a regulatory standpoint, it's voluntary. For this company, it's not. So even their greenhouse gas emissions are regulated. The other element that was important to this company here is that their greenhouse gas estimation was much more involved than it is for most companies. They were not taking values off of an invoice that they got from their utility company, multiplying that by an emission factor and getting the final answer out that they wanted. They were collecting samples of their coal hundreds of times a year, analyzing that for carbon content, water content, sulfur content, feeding all that data into their calculations to understand their greenhouse gas emissions as well as their emissions of their co-pollutants. And what that means for them is that the accuracy of their emissions reporting, again, both of greenhouse gases and co-pollutants, is really critical. That accuracy is important to everybody, but it was really critical for this company who's under a lot of scrutiny from regulators as well as their customers and their shareholders. And so managing both of these reporting processes together helps them achieve the level of accuracy that they need to really satisfy all of those stakeholders. I hope throughout this talk you've seen the advantages of bringing these two activities into alignment when we can effectively manage both our greenhouse gas reporting and our co-pollutant reporting, and how that can lead to increased accuracy, increased efficiency, as well as strategic reductions opportunities. Happy to take any questions.